Hello, and I thought today the Bad Law Project would take us on a whistle-stop tour through the legal hot mess that is PSHE, otherwise known as Personal, Social and Health and Economic Education, and RSE, Relationships, Sex, Education. Both PSHE and RSE are taught at primary and secondary school levels. And as many of you will be aware, in 2020, relationships and sex education was made compulsory for all secondary school pupils in England. The then Secretary of State for Education, Gavin Williamson, stated at the time that he wanted primary schools to put in place the key building blocks of healthy, respectful relationships and teach children how to be healthy. Secondary schools would then build on that initial knowledge formed at primary school level with an increased focus on risk areas such as drugs or alcohol, as well as introducing knowledge about intimate relationships and sex, and providing generalized teaching on mental well-being in order, quote, to develop resilience and character, the type of resilience and character that we know are fundamental to pupils being happy and successful and productive members of society. Our brave new world. When I was of secondary school age, I went to a state school in Essex that actually ran and owned a farm. And personally speaking, I would highly recommend that for developing children's resilience and character. We were chucked at cows during milking time, and we were allowed to watch pigs mating, which does, I think, build resilience and character. We mucked out stalls, we lay down straw, we rounded up stray sheep. Some of the time the sheep actually entered the classroom after escaping from the farm. We gathered eggs from chickens, honey from bees, we weeded, we planted seeds, we played with puppies and baby rabbits. And I just think, couldn't every school in England just have a few hens? Anyway, this is a digression, I appreciate. In 2020, the UK government decided that by making RSE mandatory, it would give children the knowledge and capability to take care of themselves and receive support if problems arose. That was the point of RSE. But as some of us know, the result of mandatory RSE was not scores of happy, resilient children, but routine indoctrination sessions celebrating something called gender identity, with the result that significant numbers of young people have begun exhibiting profound confusion about whether they are boys or girls, and many of them deciding on a different identity altogether, such as transgender or non-binary. And this has contributed to unmitigated chaos for families up and down the country. Many children now exhibiting what I would call dissociative tendencies, dissociation from their growing, developing, changing prepubescent or pubescent bodies, convinced that biological sex isn't an obstacle to the fantasy world of gender identity, where you can be the opposite sex, trans, or you can be both sexes at the same time, gender fluid, or you could be neither sex, non-binary. Now, the Bad Law Project does not say that full culpability for this situation lies with the government. That nest of vipers out there that is the online world tells kids all sorts of things, and they range from quirky to banal to downright criminal. And none of us may properly claim that we have stopped that world from entering our homes and our minds and our children's minds. But government action, as is so often the case, has not helped. We are all aware by now, or we should be, of the serious nature of the decision to change sex, the mental, physical and medical implications of a child or a young person opting to reject their biological sex before or during puberty. And the Bad Law Project, as some of you will also know, has collected distressing stories from parents whose family lives have been sabotaged by what we are now allowed to call gender identity ideology. That is the phrase now used by government. That is the ideology that a person can be born in the wrong body and that this is no big deal, that there are pharmaceutical and surgical solutions to being born in the wrong body, and these carry no long-term risks, and that where a child expresses interest in rejecting his or her biology, this must be celebrated and affirmed. And you can see on the Bad Law Project's media feed the story told by Mrs. X, where she gives a harrowing account of how gender identity ideology has destroyed her and her family's life. Or you could, for some lighter relief, Google the story of Rye College in East Sussex. In June 2023, that story made the headlines when two 13-year-old girls mocked gender identity, calling it ridiculous in a PSHE lesson. And the girls' teacher lost the proverbial, telling the girls that they were sad, despicable, that they must not question anyone's identity, that there were more than two genders and it was not an opinion. And what's more, they should be sent away to another school, possibly for a re-education program. In spite of all this and the feelings of the country at large about the dubious nature of gender identity and its ideological promoters, the ideology has been, as many of you know, relentlessly pushed in schools since RSE was made mandatory in 2020. Why? Well, this is a whistle-stop tour of the mess we're in, and so I'm going to give three simple reasons why this has happened. Section 149 of the Equality Act 2010 set down something called the Public Sector Equality Duty, and that applies across England, Scotland and Wales, and it requires all public authorities, including schools, to have regard to equality issues when exercising their functions. That's the first point. Then schools who were mandated to teach RSE from 2020 were told in statutory guidance issued by government that schools had to teach children about gender identity as part of their equality duty, because the Equality Act lists something called gender reassignment, which is the formal process by which a person legally changes their sex, as a protected characteristic, which means something that a person cannot be discriminated against for possessing. And we know that the LGBT lobby group Stonewall heavily influenced the government guidance which accompanied the mandatory duty to teach RSE. And we know that in 2023, Stonewall convinced the Department for Education that there were no safeguarding risks attached to teaching young people to celebrate gender identity and gender transition, because Nancy Kelly, the former CEO of Stonewall, told us so via her Twitter account. That post, by the way, has since been deleted. And then thirdly, schools were told by government, again in statutory guidance issued in 2019, to ensure that people be taught the facts and the law about gender identity. And they should teach this in an age-appropriate and inclusive way, and in a clear, sensitive and respectful manner. Why? Because many young people may be discovering their gender identity. That was the wording of the statutory guidance. Unfortunately, the 2019 guidance doesn't clarify what the facts and the law are in respect of gender identity, and cannot, now or then, do so because gender identity isn't a legal category and it is not defined in law. The guidance required schools to ensure, nonetheless, that LGBT content be fully integrated. So not just taught as a standalone unit or a standalone lesson, but integrated and spread across programs of study throughout the curriculum. And also unhelpfully, the government guidance left schools completely free to determine how they should do that. Now, because head teachers, understandably, had no idea what really was involved in teaching so-called LGBT content and the law and the facts around gender identity, they ran to consultants claiming to be experts in the field for help. Or rather, the consultants, shall we say, came to the schools, piping sweet tunes in the dulcet tones of equality and diversity and inclusion for a small fee, naturally, Oh, and how they descended on this cornered market over which they and they alone held exclusive monopoly. Stonewall, now heavily discredited. Mermaids, now heavily discredited. And Educate and Celebrate, now mysteriously shut down, were among the many, many, many groups posing as consultants from the so-called third sector charities tasked with designing core RSE content for schools and promoting, and I will repeat that word, promoting gender ideology as the best thing to happen to kids since Disney. The Bad Law Project wrote about this in a report called The Case Against PSHE, Reframing the Debate. And that came out in 2023. And we wrote in that report, in failing to deal with the spread of gender identity politics in schools, children have been put at an increased risk of harm, including self-harm. Responsibility for this oversight lies not only with the schools, but with the third sector, organisations who use charity status to assert their authority and expertise over schools and which have monopolised control over PSHE teaching and content. By means of an organisational third sector takeover, a group of niche academics have successfully institutionalised controversial ideas about gender identity. Our report discussed at length the implications not only of promoting medical transition, but also the seemingly more innocent or innocuous idea of social transition. That includes practices such as changing your name or your appearance, and then teachers affirming that new name and affirming that appearance, and even promoting practices that are not technically considered medical, such as chest binders, which prevent and restrict the development of healthy breasts in girls. In 2023, we wrote, social transitioning practices are often considered harmless since they seem no different from the kind of personal experimentation with appearance and identity that we expect from healthy adolescents, such as dyeing one's hair, getting a piercing, or listening to subcultural genres of music. These practices are assumed to be another world away from taking medical, physiological or hormone treatments to alter your physical body. But social transition is far from harmless. Within the framework of gender ideology, as promoted in PSHE, a change of hairstyle, a change of name, a change of pronoun or dress code has become something historically unprecedented. It has become an alter ego. The child is initiated through rituals of social transition into a new gender identity which comes at the expense of everything which went before. Hence the chilling concept of the dead name, the name that the parent gives the child that it loves. As the group Transgender Trend has stated, it is currently unclear what the long-term psychological effects will be for children who undergo social transition, for some or all of their childhood. We do not know how this impacts on the development of a sense of self. And the Bad Law Project considers the celebration of children socially transitioning without any medical intervention whatever as the outcome of what might be called a PSHE mindset that has become entrenched in British schools. And frankly, one day, the social transitioning of children, again, aside from any medical intervention, will be seen for what it is, which is the blatant encouragement in children of dissociative disorders under the banner of equality, diversity, and inclusion. So that's where we are, or should I say where we were. Gender identity ideology has been tirelessly promoted in schools, but the pushback in this country has been significant, not least amongst the parents of transitioning children. I would say perhaps the most marginalised voices in this entire debate. Many of them have been effectively silenced by both the love of their children, whose circumstances they don't wish to drag into the limelight, but also by the constant reprimand of political activists in government, in the third sector, and in schools who preach that any parent not on board with their child's chosen gender identity, no matter how old that child is a bully and a bigot. But the pushback from parents and many others deeply concerned by the casual way in which gender transition has been normalised in education and mainstreamed has led to a quasi or semi-healthy national debate about the need to amend or reform the Equality Act so as to establish clarity on the appropriate age at which a person may legally, medically or socially be said to have begun to acquire the protected characteristic of gender reassignment. At present, the Equality Act 2010 is silent on the age question. If we read it literally, it tells us that any person, and that could include a child of any age, who is deemed to have begun the process of reassigning sex by changing any attribute of their appearance, such as hairstyle or name, is technically, at law, a transsexual. Did Parliament intend the law to be read in that way? In a way that only a handful of perhaps quite extreme ideologues would approve of? I suspect not. Even the activists who were working at the time the Equality Act was being drafted to make transgenderism a protected characteristic in law did not feel comfortable with the idea that a minor under 18 was a suitable candidate for gender reassignment. And if we go to the official parliamentary record in Hansard, which covers the discussions over introduction of what was then called the Equality Bill in 2008-2009, we find the transgender rights activist Stephen Whittle reported in Hansard as stating that, and I quote, "Gender reassignment is an absolutely inappropriate term to use in relation to young people. If someone rings me up about their 11-year-old with cross-gendered behaviour and the school wants them out, what should I do? Should I say, let me speak to the 11-year-old and then explain that the child wants a sex change? 13 and 14-year-olds who make that statement get entwined in a huge goal-driven medical process that does not let them get out. Yet we all know that 80% of young people who manifest very cross-gendered behaviour will not grow up to be trans, but gay or lesbian." That is Professor Stephen Whittle, transgender activist, speaking about the then Equality Bill in 2008. But we are where we are. Gender reassignment is the legal term used in equality legislation, and the Equality Act could be, and routinely is interpreted, as applying to any child of any age the term gender reassignment, where it is understood that the child is beginning the process of reassigning their sex. And the Equality Act makes clear, again, that any child to whom the term gender reassignment is applied is a transsexual at law. But something does need to give here for sure. And frankly, on the issue of children's transsexual or gender reassignment status, the Equality Act is no help. It raises more questions than it answers. But the Equality Act 2010 is not the only law of the land. The word that I've heard most often used, particularly by parents of children who've been encouraged to transition at school, is the word indoctrination. And whilst the Equality Act 2010 doesn't help us with the issue of child indoctrination in schools, other laws do help us. They help us very, very much. Section 406, subsection 1 of the Education Act 1996 defines political indoctrination explicitly, stating that the local authority, governing body or head teacher shall forbid the pursuit of partisan political activities by any of those registered pupils at a maintained school who are junior pupils, and the promotion of partisan political views in the teaching of any subject in the school or in the teaching of any aspect of a curriculum provided in the school. Section 407, subsection 1 of the same Act, the Education Act 1996, sets down a duty to secure balanced treatment of political issues, stating the local education authority, governing body and head teachers shall take such steps as are reasonably practicable to secure that where political issues are brought to the attention of pupils while they are in attendance at school, they are offered a balanced presentation of opposing views. Now, what these provisions amount to is fundamentally the right of the child not to be indoctrinated at school. And this right, in our view, has to be one of the most fundamental cornerstones of our democracy, since without political indoctrination in schools, it is very, very hard for any democracy to be transformed into a totalitarian tyranny of the kind that we witnessed, for example, in the 20th century in Maoist China. So why is this super duper legislation rarely, if ever, discussed today? Why aren't teachers trained in it? Why don't parents know about it? Why has it been left out of the culture war debates, particularly in respect of schools where it would be so relevant? Well, I'm afraid your guess is as good as mine. But what sections 406 and 407 of the Education Act 1996 mean, as a matter of clear black letter law, is that any political ideology, and that is a controversial or a contested political position, can only be taught in schools if it is taught in a non-partisan way. That is to say, you can present a position, but you cannot promote it without presenting at the same time alternative views in order to provide fair and dispassionate balance. And that phrase comes from the case of Dimmock and Secretary of State for Education and Skills. And that is the key case authority when trying to narrow down what the definition of political indoctrination in schools is. And if we look at the Independent School Standards Guidance for independent schools that was published in 2019, there the case of Dimmock is relied upon, and it is stated in that guidance that indoctrination is the promotion of partisan political views, and the best synonym for partisan is one-sided. So, in deciding whether the promotion of a political view is one-sided, the guidance lays out some factors to be taken into account, including where schools provide a superficial treatment of important subject matter without sufficient explanation, without indicating that the subject is actually a controversial subject, or where schools use data misleadingly, creating misrepresentations of the facts and half-truths, or where materials are deployed by schools in such a way as to prevent pupils from testing the truth of the claims in order to understand whether or not the sources are reliable, or where schools exalt certain individuals and figures and their motives whilst demonizing those who oppose or criticize those figures and their motives, or where schools advocate a particular position as the right view, which must be adopted, because if you don't adopt that view, then negative consequences will follow. This has all been laid out in some of the guidance that schools have been given, following on from the case of Dimmock, in order to show the steps that schools should take to avoid politically indoctrinating children. Again, I'm sure many people watching this never heard of any of this. But I say it's a reasonable legal approach to the important issue of political indoctrination, which separates democracy from tyranny. And you'd think it'd be highly relevant to the national debate about indoctrination of children in gender identity ideology in schools, because many of us, parents, teachers, legal professionals, are concerned about what can be called the clear promotion of gender identity ideology at the expense of alternative or competing views, because this ideology in particular does pose some risk to children. It's a mystery as to why we never hear about the Education Act 1996 in the context of this fraught debate. The Department for Education has, quite simply, ignored this legislation and, in our view, its rather marvellous prohibition of political indoctrination in schools. For example, in December 2023, the Department for Education, feeling considerable heat from parents and teachers and other concerned citizens worried about indoctrination in schools, felt moved to show that it was being proactive on the main issues of concern, those being, in the first place, hypersexual and age-inappropriate teaching materials being used in sex education classes, 2, parents being told by schools that they couldn't access teaching materials due to copyright protection serving the private companies that design the materials. And of course, 3, school teaching materials which promote gender identity ideology in a very one-sided way. So how did the department show that it was taking these issues seriously? Well, on the 19th of December 2023, the department issued some draft guidance, which it opened up for public consultation, in which it defined gender identity ideology as a contested belief. The belief that a person can have a gender, whether male or man or female or woman or other, that is different to their actual biological sex. But it remained unclear in this guidance whether schools should be teaching this or not, and what the law actually says about indoctrination in schools. In other words, the guidance completely ignored the Education Act 1996. And moreover, it tacitly endorsed the social transitioning of children in schools, giving schools the arbitrary discretion as to whether they facilitate the social transitioning of children, which is a clinical area of competence which lies outside the jurisdiction of schools, or not. Why? Why did the government ignore good law in what is clearly such a muddy area, especially since in the December 2023 guidance, the Department for Education admitted that the Equality Act 2010 was not fit for purpose when it comes to providing legally coherent guidance on this issue? A group of parents, supported by the Bad Law Project, has sought to rectify this situation, which we say has been caused by the willful neglect of solid legal regulations that exist in our country and which prohibit explicitly political indoctrination in schools. And these parents rely on the Education Act 1996, and they are demanding from the Department for Education and from the courts a clear declaration that the promotion of gender identity ideology, that is to say, teaching it to children without a balanced presentation of the debate around this issue, must be unlawful. And we have to wait and see what happens there. As most of us know, law crawls. It crawls at a glacial pace behind the social media frenzy. And so at the moment, that case remains a space to watch. But then last week, Gillian Keegan, who is the Secretary of State for Education, announced yet more government proposals that again seem to reflect many of our concerns in this nation about gender identity in schools and the indoctrination question. And new draft guidance has been published, draft relationships education and relationships and sex education and health education guidance, which proposes, in respect of gender reassignment, and now I'm reading from paragraphs 43 to 46, that pupils should be taught the law about gender reassignment and be clear that an individual must be 18 before they can legally reassign their gender. And that means that a child's legal sex will always be the same as their biological sex, and at school, boys cannot be legally classified as girls or vice versa. Paragraph 44, if a child is questioning their gender, schools should refer to the guidance for schools and colleges on gender questioning pupils. Paragraph 45, schools shouldn't teach about the broader concept of gender identity because gender identity is a highly contested and complex subject, reads the guidance. It is a sense that a person may have of their own gender, whether male or female, and this may not be the same as their biological sex, which many people do not consider as valid, because many people do not believe or consider that there is such a thing as a separate gender identity from biological sex. And then paragraph 46, if asked about the topic of gender identity, schools should teach the facts about biological sex and not use materials that present contested views as fact, including the view that gender is a spectrum. I would suggest, the Bad Law Project would suggest, that this is a direct reference to the Education Act 1996 and its prohibition on political indoctrination. But why not say so? The new draft RSE statutory guidance is certainly full of promising promises, and these have nothing to do whatsoever with a forthcoming election, of course. But as Mary Poppins said, promises are pie crust, easily made, easily broken. The question that we at the Bad Law Project are still stuck with is why, in the middle of the maelstrom that is PSHE and RSE teaching, with all the equality, diversity and inclusion content that has been generated, along with old guidance, fresh guidance, statutory guidance, non-statutory guidance, why does the Department for Education not make life easier for itself and gently remind the country's schools of the provisions that are set down clearly in sections 406 and 407 of the Education Act 1996, namely that political indoctrination in schools is unlawful. End of. Spread the